November 3, 1944. The Hürtgen Forest, Germany. Hauptfeldwebel Otto Reinhardt pressed himself into the frozen earth as another burst of fire ripped through the pine branches above his head. The sound was different from the MG-42, different from the Russian Maxims he had survived on the Eastern Front. This was slower, deeper, methodical. Each round arrived with the weight of a sledgehammer, splintering trees, punching through the stone wall of the farmhouse his squad had occupied just moments before. Through the smoke and falling snow, Reinhardt could see the American half-track 200 meters distant, its turret-mounted gun traversing slowly from left to right. The gunner was not firing wildly. He was simply erasing Reinhardt's defensive position, one burst at a time. When the firing paused, Reinhardt grabbed his radio and spoke words that would appear in dozens of German after-action reports from the Western Front. All units, disengage from fixed positions. The 50 caliber has found us. What Hauptfeldwebel Reinhardt could not know, lying in that frozen German forest, was that he had just encountered the most ubiquitous heavy weapon in the American arsenal, a machine gun so reliable, so abundantly supplied, and so psychologically devastating that it would fundamentally alter German tactical doctrine in the West. The weapon was not sophisticated, it was not the fastest firing, it was not even particularly new, having entered American service more than a decade before the war began. But the M2 Browning 50 caliber machine gun possessed three qualities that German forces found impossible to counter. It worked every single time. It was mounted on virtually every American combat vehicle, and the Americans had so much ammunition for it that they fired it continuously, without restraint, without concern for conservation. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The transformation had begun 2 years earlier, in the deserts of North Africa. German forces fighting in Tunisia during Operation Torch had first encountered American firepower in concentrated form. Obergefreiter Hans Schmidt, a veteran machine gunner who had fought at Stalingrad, found himself assigned to defend against American forces advancing from the Kasserine Pass in early 1943. Schmidt had learned to respect Soviet firepower. Russian artillery could saturate entire grid squares. Russian infantry attacked in waves that seemed endless. But the Russians, Schmidt knew, could be stopped. Their artillery telegraphed its intentions with ranging shots. Their attacks followed predictable patterns. German defensive doctrine, refined through 2 years of Eastern Front combat, provided effective responses. The Americans were something else entirely. Schmidt's first encounter came on a clear morning in February 1943. His squad had established a textbook defensive position overlooking a wadi north of Tunis. Good fields of fire, excellent cover. The position would have held against a Soviet attack for hours, perhaps days. Then Schmidt heard an unfamiliar sound overhead. A small aircraft, engine puttering, barely flying faster than a man could sprint. Schmidt barely glanced at it. Such liaison aircraft carried no weapons. They posed no threat. His attention remained fixed on the approach routes, watching for American armor. 3 minutes after the aircraft passed overhead, Schmidt's world exploded. Not with the familiar crack of artillery, not with the scream of diving Stukas. The rounds simply arrived. No warning, no ranging shots. Just the simultaneous impact of dozens of shells, landing in a pattern that suggested impossible precision. But it was what came after that would haunt Schmidt for the rest of the war. As German survivors attempted to regroup, American vehicles appeared on the ridgeline. Half-tracks, trucks, even jeeps. And mounted on every single vehicle was the same weapon, a heavy machine gun with a distinctive profile, and they all began firing at once. Schmidt had trained his entire military career on the principle of fire discipline. German machine gun doctrine emphasized controlled bursts. Ammunition was precious. Every round had to count. The MG-34 and its successor, the MG-42, were magnificent weapons, superior in many ways to any Allied machine gun. But German doctrine required gunners to conserve ammunition, to fire only when targets presented themselves, to calculate every burst. The Americans calculated nothing. They simply fired. The 50 caliber machine guns opened up from 600 meters and did not stop. They fired at suspicious bushes. They fired at rock formations. They fired at empty terrain. The volume of fire was incomprehensible to Schmidt. In 5 minutes, the American vehicles expended more 50 caliber ammunition than Schmidt's entire company had been allocated for a week of operations. The German survivors of that engagement, fewer than a dozen from Schmidt's company of over 100 men, were taken prisoner. In the POW cages at Bizerte, Schmidt spoke with other captured German soldiers. The conversations revealed a pattern that would repeat itself across every theater where German forces faced Americans. The weapon mounted on every American vehicle was the Browning M2, a 50 caliber heavy machine gun. Initial German intelligence assessments dismissed it as tactically insignificant. The weapon fired only 450 to 575 rounds per minute. The German MG-42, by contrast, achieved 1,200 rounds per minute, more than twice the rate. This assessment would prove catastrophically wrong. The M2's slower rate of fire was not a weakness, it was a feature. The weapon could fire continuously for minutes at a time without barrel changes. It operated reliably in temperatures from -40 to +40 degrees Celsius. It functioned after being submerged in water, caked in mud, or exposed to desert sand. Most importantly, it was manufactured in quantities that German industry could not match. By the time of the Normandy invasion in June 1944, American forces had deployed nearly 350,000 M2 heavy barrel variants, plus more than 1.5 million of all 50 caliber machine gun types for aircraft and other applications. German military intelligence officers attempting to analyze American firepower capabilities struggled to comprehend the numbers. Lieutenant Friedrich Bauer, an artillery officer who had coordinated counter-battery fire on the Eastern Front, examined captured American equipment tables in late 1943. What he discovered challenged every assumption about military logistics. An American infantry division included 3650 caliber machine guns in its infantry regiments alone. Additional M2s were mounted on every half-track, every truck, every jeep in the divisional reconnaissance company. American armored divisions had even more. Tank destroyers mounted 50 calibers for anti-aircraft defense and infantry suppression. The M16 multiple gun motor carriage mounted 450 calibers in a powered turret, creating a weapon system that could deliver 2,200 rounds per minute of combined fire. But the weapon itself was only half the equation. Bauer's analysis of captured American ammunition revealed the true scope of the disparity. A single American armored division advancing through France could call upon more 50 caliber ammunition than an entire German panzer corps. American logistics doctrine allocated seemingly unlimited quantities of ammunition for weapons that German doctrine would have carefully rationed. The psychological impact of this abundance manifested in ways German commanders found difficult to quantify but impossible to ignore. Stabsfeldwebel Kurt Zimmermann, a veteran NCO who had fought through France in 1940 and Russia in 1941 and 42, encountered American forces during the fighting in Normandy in July 1944. Zimmermann's company had established defensive positions in the bocage, the dense hedgerow country that characterized the Norman countryside. The terrain heavily favored defense. Each field was surrounded by thick earthen banks topped with hedgerows. German doctrine called for positioning machine guns to cover the gaps where attackers would be forced to advance. The system had worked effectively against British attacks. Against the Americans, the system failed immediately. Rather than attempting to penetrate the hedgerows at their weakest points, American vehicles simply began firing their 50 caliber machine guns through the vegetation. The heavy rounds did not penetrate the earthen banks, but they shredded the hedgerows themselves, stripping away concealment. More critically, they created a suppression effect that prevented German soldiers from returning effective fire. Zimmermann watched as American infantry advanced behind a literal wall of 50 caliber fire. Multiple vehicles firing continuously, sweeping the hedgerows from left to right, then right to left. German soldiers attempting to engage the advancing infantry found themselves unable to raise their heads above the protective berms. The 50 caliber rounds, even when they did not directly hit defenders, created a psychological environment that Zimmermann described in his diary as like being inside a thunderstorm made of metal. The Americans called this tactic reconnaissance by fire. Rather than carefully probing for enemy positions, they simply fired continuously at any location that might conceal defenders. The doctrine worked because American logistics could sustain it. Trucks brought forward thousands of rounds of 50 caliber ammunition daily. When ammunition was expended, more trucks brought more ammunition. For German defenders, the mathematics were simple and devastating. They could not return fire without exposing themselves to American fire. They could not remain in position because American fire would eventually find them. They could not retreat because American fire covered all likely withdrawal routes. The only option was to abandon prepared positions and attempt to establish new defensive lines further back, under conditions that made organized withdrawal nearly impossible. The ubiquity of the weapon compounded its effectiveness. German soldiers learned that every American vehicle was a threat. A lone jeep might carry a 50 caliber on a pedestal mount. A supply truck could have one mounted on the cab. Half-tracks bristled with them. Even damaged or disabled American vehicles often continued to pose threats because their mounted 50 calibers remained operational even when the vehicles themselves were immobilized. Oberleutnant Joachim Weber, a company commander in the 716th Infantry Division, documented this phenomenon in a report written after his capture in September 1944. Weber described an engagement where his company had successfully ambushed an American supply convoy, destroying several trucks with Panzerfaust anti-tank weapons. The ambush should have been a German success. The American trucks were stopped, blocking the road. American infantry had taken cover. But then the American truck drivers began manning their 50 caliber machine guns. Even vehicles that were burning, even trucks that would clearly never move again, had gunners who began returning fire. The volume of return fire transformed a successful ambush into a stalemate, then into a German defeat. Weber's machine gun positions, which should have been able to suppress American infantry indefinitely, found themselves taking fire from a dozen 50 caliber machine guns simultaneously. Within minutes, 3 of Weber's 6 machine gun positions had been destroyed. The survivors had exhausted their ammunition attempting to suppress the American vehicle-mounted weapons. When American reinforcements arrived 30 minutes later, Weber's company was in no condition to continue the fight. The ambush had cost the Americans perhaps a half-dozen casualties and 3 destroyed trucks. It had cost Weber's company over 40 men killed or wounded, plus all 6 of his machine gun positions. The pattern repeated itself across the Western Front. German tactical doctrine, which emphasized economy of force and careful allocation of firepower, could not compete with American doctrine, which emphasized overwhelming application of firepower regardless of cost. The disparity became most apparent in urban combat, where German defenders had traditionally held significant advantages. Gefreiter Paul Richter, assigned to a Panzergrenadier company defending a French town during the fighting in Lorraine in October 1944, experienced the collision of doctrines firsthand. Richter's company had fortified stone buildings overlooking the town's main approach. The positions were textbook defensive emplacements. Stone walls provided excellent cover. Fields of fire covered all approaches. German doctrine suggested the position could hold for days against conventional attack. The American attack began not with infantry, but with 50 caliber fire. Tanks positioned at street corners began systematically destroying the building facades. The fire was not aimed at specific targets. The American gunners simply traversed their 50 calibers back and forth across building fronts, firing continuously. The massive rounds punched through stone walls as if they were plywood. Richter watched as positions his company had spent days preparing were simply erased, one burst at a time. German return fire proved largely ineffective. When defenders attempted to engage American armor with Panzerfausts, the anti-tank teams found themselves under immediate suppression from multiple 50 caliber machine guns. The weapon's range of 1,800 meters meant that American vehicles could engage German positions from distances where Panzerfausts were useless. Even when German infantry did successfully disable American tanks, the supporting vehicles continued to provide covering fire that prevented German forces from exploiting their success. The psychological erosion was cumulative. Richter's diary, recovered after his capture, documents the progressive breakdown of his unit's combat effectiveness. After the first day of fighting, casualties were moderate, but confidence was shaken. The knowledge that stone walls offered no real protection against 50 caliber fire meant that defenders felt exposed even in covered positions. By the second day, soldiers were abandoning positions before direct fire actually engaged them. The distinctive sound of the M2's slower, methodical rate of fire became a signal to withdraw. By the third day, Richter's company had effectively ceased to function as a cohesive unit. Individual soldiers survived, but the organization had been destroyed not primarily by casualties, but by the realization that German defensive doctrine had no answer to American firepower doctrine. The disparity extended to every aspect of the American military machine. German Luftwaffe pilots, who had achieved significant success against British and Soviet bombers, found American heavy bombers protected by defensive firepower that exceeded anything they had encountered before. Each B-17 Flying Fortress carried 13 Browning 50 caliber machine guns. A typical bomber formation of 36 aircraft meant 468 heavy machine guns, all firing the same 50 caliber Browning machine gun cartridge. Oberleutnant Heinrich Wurmheller, a fighter pilot with 93 confirmed victories, described attacking American bomber formations in a letter to his family in October 1943. To engage the Americans, Wurmheller wrote, was to fly through a continuous storm of tracer fire. German cannon-armed fighters could destroy a bomber with a few well-placed hits, but reaching effective cannon range meant penetrating a defensive perimeter where every meter of airspace contained dozens of 50 caliber rounds. The mathematics were brutal. A German fighter attacking from 12 o'clock high, standard doctrine for Focke-Wulf 1, 90 pilots, would face fire from the nose guns and top turret of every bomber in the formation. A formation of 18 bombers meant 36 heavy machine guns, engaging a single fighter. The combined defensive firepower exceeded 6,000 rounds per minute. German pilots learned to respect the American formation defensive fire to the point where it altered fundamental tactics. Rather than pressing home attacks against bomber formations, Luftwaffe units increasingly broke off engagements after initial passes. This allowed bombers to continue to their targets largely unmolested, which was precisely the American strategic objective. The weapon's reliability compounded its tactical effectiveness. German weapons were often superior in design specifications. The MG-42 was an engineering masterpiece, capable of rate of fire that American weapons could not match. German anti-aircraft guns were renowned for their effectiveness. German armor had thickness and sloping that made it difficult for American tanks to penetrate. But sophistication meant complexity. Complex weapons required careful maintenance. They were prone to malfunction under adverse conditions. German logistics, strained by Allied air attacks and overextended supply lines, could not provide the level of support that complex weapons required. By late 1944, German units operated at reduced strength not because of combat casualties alone, but because weapons were inoperative due to lack of spare parts or maintenance capabilities. The M2 Browning required minimal maintenance and continued to function under conditions that would disable more sophisticated weapons. American soldiers told stories of 50 caliber machine guns that continued firing after being submerged during river crossings, weapons that functioned normally after being buried in mud during artillery barrages, machine guns that operated reliably despite being hit by German small arms fire that damaged non-critical components. This reliability meant that every M2 in the American inventory remained operational. German intelligence estimates of American equipment strength could assume that if a unit was documented as having a 50 caliber machine gun, that weapon was functional and ready to fire. The same assumption could not be made for German equipment, where a Significant percentage of weapons were inoperative at any given time due to mechanical failures or lack of maintenance. The contrast became starker as the war progressed. German industry, under continuous Allied bombing, struggled to maintain production of any weapons systems, let alone sophisticated ones. Ammunition shortages became chronic. By late 1944, German machine gun companies that should have operated with 6 guns typically operated with 2 or 3. Ammunition allocations that should have allowed for sustained fire were reduced to a few rounds per weapon per day. American production only accelerated. Factories across the United States produced M2 machine guns in quantities that exceeded combat losses by orders of magnitude. Rock Island Arsenal, Frigidaire, Guide Lamp, AC Spark Plug, and other manufacturers produced tens of thousands of weapons monthly. The ammunition production infrastructure could sustain seemingly unlimited expenditure. Hauptfeldwebel Reinhardt, whose radio call had opened this account, survived his encounter with American firepower in the Hürtgen Forest. He was captured 3 days later, along with the remnants of his company, after American forces surrounded the German position. In the POW cage, Reinhardt spoke with other captured German soldiers about their experiences. The conversations revealed a pattern that transcended individual units or tactical situations. German soldiers who had fought on the Eastern Front, who had survived Stalingrad and Kursk, consistently reported that American firepower was more devastating than anything they had faced against the Soviets. Not because American weapons were more sophisticated, but because American logistics could sustain continuous application of overwhelming force. The 50 caliber machine gun became the symbol and the instrument of that force. It was not the most feared weapon in the German imagination. Artillery and air power inflicted more casualties. Tank, destroyers killed more German armor. But the 50 caliber was ubiquitous. It was always present. It could engage any target, and it never ran out of ammunition. German tactical doctrine had no effective counter to a weapon system that could be deployed in such overwhelming numbers with such abundant logistical support. Individual German soldiers were well trained and disciplined. German defensive positions were carefully prepared according to doctrine refined through years of combat. German weapons were often superior in technical specifications. But none of these advantages mattered when American forces could bring dozens of 50 caliber machine guns to bear on any defensive position and could sustain fire until the position was destroyed. The mathematics were inescapable. German forces in the West operated under constant firepower suppression, unable to maneuver, unable to concentrate, unable to employ their tactical skills effectively. The implications would become fully apparent during the final German offensive in the West. The Ardennes campaign, launched in December 1944, represented Germany's last attempt to achieve a decisive victory through operational maneuver. The offensive would reveal, in the most brutal terms possible, the extent to which American material superiority had fundamentally altered the nature of warfare on the Western Front. December 16, 1944. The Ardennes Forest, Belgium. Over 200,000 German troops and approximately 1,000 tanks launched Hitler's final gamble in the West. The offensive achieved complete tactical surprise. American forces, thinly spread across a supposedly quiet sector, reeled back under the initial assault. For the first 72 hours, it appeared possible that German armor might break through to the Meuse River and split the Allied armies. Then American logistics reasserted itself, and with it, the M2 Browning 50 caliber machine gun, Oberst. Heinrich Müller commanded an infantry regiment from the 6th SS Panzer Army during the opening days of the offensive. His regiment had advanced nearly 30 kilometers in the first 2 days, overrunning American positions that had been established with minimal preparation for defense. Victory seemed within reach. On the morning of December 19th, Müller's regiment encountered an American blocking position near the town of Stavelot. The position should have been vulnerable. American forces had established it hurriedly, with limited preparation time. The defenders were a mixed force of infantry and stragglers from units that had been overrun during the initial German advance. What Müller did not know was that American logistics had been working continuously since the offensive began. Every available vehicle had been commandeered to rush reinforcements and supplies to the Ardennes. Those supplies included tens of thousands of rounds of 50 caliber ammunition. The American blocking position, thrown together in haste, had one critical advantage. It had abundant ammunition for its 50 caliber machine guns. Müller's attack began with a textbook infantry assault, supported by the few tanks his regiment still had operational after 3 days of continuous combat. German infantry advanced in small groups, using terrain for concealment, attempting to close with the American positions. At 400 meters, American 50 caliber fire began. The M2s were not aimed at individual soldiers. The American gunners simply traversed their weapons back and forth across the approach routes, firing continuously. The volume of fire was incomprehensible to Müller. In 15 minutes of sustained fire, the American positions expended more 50 caliber ammunition than Müller's entire division had been allocated for the entire offensive. German infantry attempting to advance found themselves pinned. The 50 caliber rounds turned trees into deadly fountains of splinters. They punched through the frozen ground, creating impact patterns that denied any possibility of cover. German soldiers learned that dropping prone, the standard response to machine gun fire, was useless. The 50 caliber rounds retained lethal velocity even after penetrating obstacles that would stop rifle fire. Müller's attack stalled within an hour. His regiment had suffered over 200 casualties without inflicting significant damage on the American position. The German tanks that should have provided breakthrough capability found themselves engaged by multiple 50 caliber machine guns firing armor-piercing rounds. While the 50 caliber could not penetrate the frontal armor of German medium and heavy tanks, it could destroy optical equipment, disable external stowage, and suppress accompanying infantry. More critically, the sustained 50 caliber fire prevented German infantry from advancing in support of their armor. Tanks without infantry support was vulnerable to American bazooka teams. When Müller attempted to coordinate a combined arms assault, American 50 caliber fire broke up the attack before German forces could close with the defensive positions. By nightfall on December 19th, Müller's regiment had effectively ceased offensive operations. The unit had not been destroyed in any conventional sense. Most of the soldiers were still alive. Most of the weapons were still functional. But the regiment's combat power had been broken by continuous exposure to American firepower that German doctrine had no way to counter. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The Battle of the Bulge would become the definitive demonstration of American material superiority over German tactical excellence. German planning had accounted for weather conditions that would neutralize American air power. The offensive began during a period of heavy fog and overcast skies that prevented Allied aircraft from operating. German planners correctly assessed that American tactical air support would be unavailable. What they failed to account for was that American ground-based firepower, particularly the 50 caliber machine gun, was unaffected by weather conditions. Throughout the opening weeks of the offensive, as American air power remained grounded, American ground forces relied heavily on their vehicle-mounted 50 calibers to provide suppressive fire and break up German attacks. The technical specifications of the M2 help explain its devastating effectiveness. The weapon fired the 50 caliber Browning machine gun cartridge, properly designated as the 12.7 by 99 mm round. The standard M33 ball round achieved a muzzle velocity of 2,910 feet per second. The projectile weighed 707 grains, or approximately 46 grams. The kinetic energy at the muzzle exceeded 12,000 foot-pounds. This was more than double the energy of standard rifle rounds, and sufficient to penetrate substantial barriers. Armor-piercing variants could defeat 19 mm of armor at 500 meters. The M8 armor-piercing incendiary round would ignite fuel or ammunition upon penetration, while the M20 armor-piercing incendiary tracer round combined penetration capability with a visible trajectory. The effective range of 1,800 meters meant that American gunners could engage targets well beyond the range of German small arms. This range advantage had profound tactical implications. German infantry attempting to close with American positions found themselves under fire long before they could return effective fire. By the time German soldiers reached ranges where their own weapons were effective, they had already suffered significant casualties and psychological stress from continuous suppression. The M2's mechanical operation contributed to its legendary reliability. The weapon operated on the short recoil principle, firing from a closed bolt. This was unusual for a machine gun but contributed to accuracy and reliability. The bolt and barrel were initially locked together and recoiled upon firing. After a short distance, the bolt and barrel unlocked, and the bolt continued to move rearwards, extracting the spent cartridge and chambering a new round from the ammunition belt. The simplicity of this design meant fewer parts to break or malfunction. The weapon could continue operating even when individual components were damaged, as long as the basic recoil mechanism remained functional. American soldiers reported instances of 50 caliber machine guns continuing to fire after being hit by German small arms fire that damaged the weapon's housing or non-critical components. The ammunition feed system was equally robust. The M2 used a disintegrating link belt that allowed ammunition to be loaded from either the left or right side by reversing specific components. This flexibility meant that vehicle-mounted weapons could be configured for optimal ammunition storage without requiring different weapon variants. The belt feed mechanism continued to function reliably even when coated in mud, sand, or other contaminants that would jam more sophisticated feed systems. But the M2's greatest advantage was not its specifications. It was the system that supported it. American logistics doctrine treated the 50 caliber machine gun as a standard weapon, allocated to virtually every combat vehicle and many support vehicles. This ubiquity meant that the American supply system was optimized for 50 caliber ammunition production and distribution. During the Battle of the Bulge, American forces initially faced ammunition shortages as German advances disrupted supply lines. For several days in late December, American units operated under restricted ammunition allocations. 50 caliber ammunition was limited to 10 rounds per gun per day in some sectors. Even under these restricted conditions, American forces had more 50 caliber ammunition available than German forces had ammunition for their equivalent weapons. When Allied supply lines were re-established after Christmas, 50 caliber ammunition flooded forward in quantities that staggered German intelligence officers. Captured American ammunition dumps contained hundreds of thousands of rounds of 50 caliber ammunition stored in weatherproof containers ready for immediate use. German ammunition dumps, by contrast, contained whatever had survived Allied air attacks and had been successfully transported through a logistics system under constant interdiction. The psychological impact of this abundance manifested in ways that transcended tactical engagements. German soldiers learned that any concentration of forces would draw immediate American fire. Any attempt to establish a defensive position would be met with sustained 50 caliber fire that would eventually destroy the position. Any movement during daylight hours risked engagement by American vehicle-mounted weapons that had ammunition to expend freely. Stabsfeldwebel Kurt Zimmermann, whose experiences in Normandy opened the second act of this story, survived the early weeks of the Bulge offensive. His diary entries from late December 1944 document the progressive psychological erosion that 50 caliber fire induced. After the first week of combat, Zimmermann noted that his soldiers flinched at the sound of any vehicle engine, anticipating the distinctive report of the M2. By the second week, soldiers were refusing to occupy positions that offered good fields of fire because such positions would inevitably draw American 50 caliber fire. Zimmermann observed that his men preferred inferior defensive positions that offered concealment over superior positions that offered good firing positions. The psychological calculus was simple. German soldiers could not effectively engage American forces under 50 caliber suppression, so occupying good firing positions merely made them better targets. By the third week, Zimmermann's company had effectively ceased to function as an offensive force. The unit maintained basic defensive posture, but soldiers would not advance under any circumstances if American vehicles were visible or audible. The knowledge that advancing meant exposure to 50 caliber fire created a paralysis that no amount of tactical skill or individual courage could overcome. The collapse of the Ardennes offensive demonstrated the fundamental transformation of warfare that American industrial capacity had achieved. German tactical doctrine, refined through 5 years of combat across multiple theaters, proved irrelevant when confronted with an opponent who could sustain overwhelming material expenditure indefinitely. German unit commanders attempting to analyze their failures consistently identified American firepower, particularly the 50 caliber machine gun, as the decisive factor. General Major Fritz Bayerlein, who commanded Panzer-Lehr Division during the fighting in France and participated in the Ardennes offensive, wrote extensively for American military historians after the war. His assessment of American firepower was clinical and devastating. Bayerlein noted that German forces could achieve local tactical superiority against American units. German soldiers were generally better trained. German tactical doctrine was more sophisticated. German weapons, in individual comparisons, were often superior. But none of these advantages mattered when American forces could bring overwhelming firepower to bear on any engagement. The 50 caliber machine gun, Bayerlein wrote, was not the most lethal American weapon. Artillery inflicted more casualties. Tank destroyers killed more German armor. But the 50 caliber was ubiquitous, always present, always supplied with abundant ammunition, always capable of engaging any target at any time. This ubiquity created a baseline of suppression that prevented German forces from employing their tactical skills effectively. By January 1945, the Ardennes offensive had collapsed entirely. German forces that had advanced 50 kilometers into American lines were driven back to their start positions. The offensive had cost Germany over 100,000 casualties, killed or wounded or captured. More critically, it had destroyed the last German reserves of men and material. The final months of the war saw American forces advancing into Germany itself. German defenders fought with determination, but the mathematics of material superiority made the outcome inevitable. American logistics could sustain operations at a tempo that German forces could not match. American firepower could suppress any defensive position. American mobility could outmaneuver German forces that lacked fuel and replacement vehicles. The 50 caliber machine gun remained central to American tactical success throughout these final campaigns. Gefreiter Otto Schmidt, the machine gunner whose encounter with American firepower in Tunisia had opened the second section of this narrative, was captured during the fighting in the Ruhr Pocket in April 1945. Schmidt had survived 3 years of combat against American forces. His experiences encapsulated the evolution of German understanding about American warfare. In Tunisia, Schmidt had been shocked by American firepower, but still believed German skill could prevail. In Normandy, he had been frustrated by American material superiority, but thought German defensive positions could hold. During the Bulge, he had been overwhelmed by the sheer abundance of American resources, but hoped German counterattacks might succeed. By April 1945, Schmidt had no illusions remaining. In the POW camp, Schmidt spoke with American interrogators about his experiences. His assessment, preserved in American military archives, provides insight into how German soldiers understood their defeat. Schmidt stated that German forces had not been outfought, they had been outproduced. American industry had created a military machine that German courage and skill could not defeat because the disparity in resources was too great. The 50 caliber machine gun, Schmidt said, symbolized this disparity. It was not a sophisticated weapon. German engineers could have designed and built equivalent or superior heavy machine guns, but Germany could not have produced them in comparable quantities, could not have distributed them as widely, and could not have supplied them with ammunition as abundantly. The weapon itself was less important than the system that supported it. This understanding came too late to affect the war's outcome, but would profoundly influence post-war military thinking. American military observers studying German combat reports identified the 50 caliber machine gun as one of the most effective American weapons of the war, not because of its technical specifications, but because of its psychological impact and its integration into American combined arms doctrine. German military historians analyzing their defeat consistently emphasized American material superiority as the decisive factor. Individual weapons, like the 50 caliber machine gun, were components of a larger system that German forces could not counter. The system combined industrial production capacity, logistics infrastructure, tactical doctrine that emphasized firepower over finesse, and strategic depth that allowed sustained operations at high intensity. The M2 Browning would continue in American service long after the war's end. The weapon that had broken German defenses in World War II would serve in Korea, Vietnam, and every subsequent American conflict. Its longevity reflected the fundamental soundness of the design and the effectiveness of American military philosophy. German officers who survived the war and went on to rebuild Germany's military forces adopted many American doctrinal concepts. The Bundeswehr, West Germany's post-war army, emphasized logistics, sustainability, and abundant firepower allocation. These were lessons learned the hard way, fighting against an opponent who had perfected the art of material warfare. The broader implications of the 50 caliber's success extended beyond individual weapon systems. American military doctrine in the post-war period would continue to emphasize firepower and material superiority over tactical sophistication. This philosophy, proven effective against Germany's tactically superior forces, would define American military operations for decades. The technical specifications that made the M2 effective remained relevant into the 21st century. The weapon's simplicity, reliability, and raw firepower made it suitable for modern warfare, despite being designed before World War II. Improved versions incorporating quick-change barrels and enhanced mounting systems entered service, but the basic design remained unchanged. For the German soldiers who faced the weapon during World War II, the experience left permanent psychological scars. Veterans speaking decades after the war consistently described the 50 caliber machine gun with a mixture of respect and remembered terror. The weapon had not killed as many German soldiers as artillery or air power, but it had been omnipresent, always threatening, always available to American forces, never running out of ammunition. Hauptfeldwebel Otto Reinhardt, whose radio call had opened this account, immigrated to the United States in the 1950s. In a 1962 interview, he reflected on his wartime experiences. Reinhardt stated that German forces had entered the war confident in their superior training and tactics. They had exited the war, understanding that modern industrial warfare rewarded material abundance over individual skill. The American 50 caliber machine gun had been the instrument that taught this lesson most effectively. It was not the weapon German soldiers feared most in any individual engagement, but it was the weapon they could never escape, never counter, never suppress. It represented American military power at its most fundamental level, abundant, reliable, overwhelming, and impossible to defeat through courage or skill alone. The story of the M2 Browning in World War II is ultimately the story of how warfare transformed during the industrial age. Individual weapons mattered less than the system that produced, distributed, and sustained them. Tactical skill mattered less than strategic depth and material resources. The Germans had brought a craftsman's approach to a mass production war. They had optimized for efficiency when the situation demanded overwhelming force. German forces throughout the war demonstrated tactical excellence, operational creativity, and individual courage. These qualities allowed them to achieve remarkable local successes against numerically superior opponents, but ultimately, these qualities could not overcome fundamental material disparity. The Americans had created a military system that could sustain high-intensity operations indefinitely, that could replace losses faster than they occurred, and that could concentrate overwhelming firepower at any point on the battlefield. The 50 caliber machine gun was both symbol and instrument of that system. German soldiers learned to hate it not because it was technically superior to German weapons, but because it represented a form of warfare they could not counter. A warfare where ammunition was abundant enough to fire continuously, where every vehicle was a weapons platform, where suppression took precedence over precision. In the final accounting, the M2 Browning's contribution to Allied victory was difficult to quantify, but impossible to dismiss. The weapon did not win battles by itself, but it created conditions where German tactical excellence became irrelevant. It denied German forces the ability to concentrate. It prevented German infantry from supporting their armor. It suppressed German defensive positions so thoroughly that American infantry could advance with confidence. Most fundamentally, it taught German forces that American material superiority was insurmountable. This psychological defeat, delivered one burst of 50 caliber fire at a time, was as important as any tactical defeat on the battlefield. German soldiers came to understand that they were fighting an opponent who could afford to expend ammunition freely, who could replace losses immediately, and who would continue operations at high intensity regardless of cost. This understanding broke German combat effectiveness more completely than any tactical defeat could have achieved. Units that maintained their tactical organization and retained their weapons ceased to resist effectively because soldiers understood resistance was futile. The mathematics were inescapable. American forces would continue to advance, supported by unlimited ammunition and overwhelming firepower, until German forces were destroyed or surrendered. The weapon that had seemed unremarkable in 1933, when it entered American service, had become by 1945 the symbol of American military power. Not the most sophisticated weapon, not the most feared in any individual engagement, but the most ubiquitous, the most reliable, and the most psychologically devastating. The weapon that taught German forces the fundamental lesson of modern warfare. In industrial age conflict, the side that can sustain higher material expenditure will prevail, regardless of tactical skill disparities. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.